All right, guys, you made it through the first half. Now we are diving into the second P of the 5 Ps of podcasting, and that is to plan. So you've done your prep work, you've done your research, you've thought about things, you've thought about your audience avatar and who your team members are and what your goals are. Now we are going to really narrow in on specifics regarding your podcast. And that starts with your show format. What in the world is a show format? Well, the format of your show is literally how your show unfolds as listeners are consuming your content. And I do recommend that you pick a show format and stick with it. You can modify it, you can make small changes here and there, but from a listener's perspective, it's always best if they kind of know what to expect in your episodes. There is nothing more frustrating for a listener than expecting one thing with your podcast and getting something completely different. So how do we prevent that from happening? We prevent that because we're creating a show format that we're going to stick to. Now, does that mean that this is so rigid that you can't change your format a little bit here and there? No, your podcast is going to grow. The way it looks when you launch, I would be very surprised if that's the way it looks a year from now or even 3 months from now. You're going to evolve as a podcaster. Your show is going to evolve. Still, audiences expect something when they hit the play button, and you have to give them what they expect, or what's going to happen? They're going to hit unsubscribe, and there you go. You've lost a listener. It's simply not worth it. If you have been subscribing to 5 podcasts and you've been jotting down some notes of what you like and what you don't like about those podcasts, get that out now, because that's going to be really helpful as we figure out your show format. Another thing you'll need is the My Podcast Plan PDF that came with your course. So if you've got that, print it out, have it right here, because we're going to go through this line by line and figure out what your show format is. In one sentence, I want you to explain what your podcast is about. One sentence. This is kind of like your elevator pitch, right? So make it short, make it concise. If you were speaking this would be 15 seconds or less, because people are going to ask you, oh, you have a podcast. What's your podcast about? And you don't want to spend the next 2 minutes going, and then I talk to this person, and then this happens. Like, come on. You need an elevator pitch. That's what this is. Get to the nuts and bolts. What is your podcast about? Once you have that, then we can come up with some additional information for your show. The biggest one probably is your podcast name. Now, this is really important. I'm going to give you some tips, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the podcast name, episode titles, and descriptions. But here's what you need to know about your podcast title. It needs to be short. It needs to be short. 4 words or less. If you can make it 3 words or less, even better. And you need to really make it focus on keywords that people would be searching for in order to find your show. This is not the time to be cute. In the past, I've used the example of my pregnancy podcast. When I titled that show, I knew I wanted it to be a short title, and I didn't know really what to say. I didn't really know what to call it. And I came up with a title that is cute and not functional. You want to hear it? Preggy Pals. Preggie space Pals. It's cute, right? Oh, we're preggy pals, we're pregnant. Here's the problem. Nobody is searching for preggy. What are they searching for? Pregnant, pregnancy, maybe maternity. So in me titling my podcast Preggy Pals, I actually hurt myself because it really needed one of those words in there. So keep that in mind with your podcast title. Make it something that people would be searching for, because it is searchable in these podcast apps. Your podcast name is searchable. Make it count. This will help you get a lot of organic traffic coming to your show. Once you determine what your show title is, I would also do a quick search to see if any other shows have that name. It's not really a copyright issue, it's more of a confusion issue, right? Because you don't want to say the name of your show and then someone goes searching for it, and then there's 5 shows that are called the same thing. So there you go. Creating your podcast name, just keep those things in mind. Categories. So what category or categories, because you can actually have multiple categories that are for your podcast, but what category does your show fall into? Now, I've created a separate document that outlines all of the current categories that Apple Podcasts currently lists. And that's really the gold standard, guys. No matter what app you prefer the best, it doesn't really matter. Apple Podcast is the 800-pound podcast gorilla. Picture a big old gorilla just sitting down here and like consuming podcasts. That is Apple Podcasts. So most people are using that platform. That is the gold standard for how we do our podcast. That's just the way it is. Maybe it'll be different in the future, but Apple Podcasts was actually the first to launch podcasts, so it kind of makes sense, right? But I have created a document that outlines all of the categories that Apple Podcasts currently allows. This changes. In fact, it was probably about a year ago from the time of this taping that Apple came out and said, you know what, the podcast industry has changed. We now have a crime genre. We've got all these different genres. We have to change our categories. And so keep in mind that this can change, and that's why I'm going to create a separate document for it. You know, I'll outline all of the categories and I'll make sure that sheet is updated for you. But it's going to be important to know what categories your show falls into. Usually most podcast host providers, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's where you're going to upload your podcast episodes to, and that's who provides you with your RSS feed. Most podcast host providers will allow around 3 categories per podcast. So keep that in mind. There's usually like a main category and some subcategories, but figure out what categories apply best to your podcast. Who is the author of your podcast? This is also SEO friendly. So if you are the author, if you are doing a show by yourself and you're the only person working on the podcast, then just put your name. If you want things to fall under a business, you could put your business. Now this is interesting. I've been able to manipulate this a little bit because I gave you the example that Preggy Pals wasn't, it didn't have any of those keywords that I really wanted to go after for pregnancy. But I was able to use a business name in the author tag that did have some of those keywords in it. So I wasn't getting picked up for pregnancy in my title, but I was getting picked up for pregnancy and parenting in my author tag because the company had some of those words in it. So you can kind of use that to, help bring people to your show as well. If it's just you, it's just you. Apple kind of frowns on having a lot of names in there. So if you have a show that has multiple hosts, your show could get flagged if you listed everybody's name in there. And that's because we had some issues a while back where people were basically keyword stuffing, if you guys know what that is. It's trying to take advantage of the SEO structure, right? Of people being able to search for certain keywords to find your content. So people started putting a whole bunch of words in there that didn't really fit just to get more people to find their show. Apple cracked down, said you can't do that anymore. And so now they're being very particular on what you put in your author tag. So my advice to you is keep it simple. Next, we're going to talk about your rating. And your rating is not how people rate you, right? So there's ratings and reviews that people can leave, and we'll talk about that when we talk about promotion. This is your rating of your content, which you basically have 2 options. Are you explicit or are you clean? And everybody is rating themselves, and there is no ratings police out there to determine what is what. In fact, I don't even think that Apple has come out and said what defines clean and what defines explicit. So kind of, you're making this decision for your own show. Here's what I will say though. If you mark it as explicit. There are several countries that will not have access to your show because they basically said any content that is marked explicit, do not show us. Okay, the whole country has made that determination. Keep in mind, this is for the benefit of your audience, and you could upset people if you marked everything as clean and your guests are throwing F-bombs and stuff like that. Keep it in mind, just saying. Next is your episode length. What do we know about episode length in general with podcasting? Here's what we know. We have podcasts that are 5 minutes long, and we have podcasts that are 3 hours long, and both have a tremendous following. So I know I totally just confused you right there, right? And I did it on purpose because when it comes to episode length, how long does an episode need to be? As long as it needs to be. Meaning, if you have compelling content, keep the proverbial cameras rolling, right? Keep the mics running. Keep the record button on because that's good stuff. In general, though, I will say that the average podcast is somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour. Number of breaks. When I say breaks, I'm referring to what I call commercial or promo breaks. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about profiting and promoting your podcast. But what you need to know now, it's a good idea as you're figuring out the format of your show to structure in a couple of breaks in your podcast. Why would you do that? Well, again, we're trying to follow an overall format, and it's good for a couple different reasons. The first is you may need a little bit of a break when you're recording, right? You may need to stop down, and having these breaks built in are a good way to stop down, especially if you have a co-host or a guest or something like that. It allows you to kind of collect your thoughts, stop for a second, see where you are on time. Just plowing through the whole episode can be kind of difficult. And the other reason is you may, down the road, want to insert something into that space. And again, we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about profiting with your show as well as promoting things within your show. But now it's important to reserve that space. The general rule of thumb with this is you can have one break, so whether that's a promo, whether that's a commercial spot, but you can have one break per 15 minutes of content. That does not mean that you have to be recording for 15 minutes before you take your first break. That just means look at the overall length of your episode. So if it's an hour-long episode, well, how many times can 15 minutes go into an hour? 4 times. That means where podcasting is right now, what podcast audiences will be okay with is up to 4 commercial or promo breaks within a 1-hour show. Let's talk about some dates. The first date that I want to talk to you about is your launch date for when your podcast goes live. And this goes back to the planning of your podcast. I want you to consider the date. I want you to put something on the calendar that says podcast goes live on this day. If you need to change it down the road, that's completely fine. But put it on the calendar, and I would even say, tell someone else about it. Tell someone else when your podcast is going to launch. Accountability goes a long way with this. You can do research. You could watch these videos a million times and still never feel prepared to launch your podcast just because it's a new thing. But you just have to start. It's kind of like having a kid. When's the best time to have a kid? There isn't the best time to have a kid, right? You just kind of have a kid. And then you figure stuff out. That's kind of what having a podcast is like. So figure out your launch date, put it on the calendar, tell someone else about it. If you need to change it later, no problem, you can change it later. Let's also talk about your release schedule. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about when, after you launch, are you going to release new episodes? How much time can you actually invest into this? That's really what this boils down to. And hopefully you had a chance to listen to some podcasts and figure out other people's release schedules. There's no right or wrong way to do this, but let me tell you what I've discovered in the past. You can have a daily show. That is technically a daily is 7 days a week, although if you have a weekday show, that also gets thrown into the daily category. So if you hear daily show, it's really 7 days a week or 5 days a week, which isn't really daily, but there you go. That gets thrown into daily. So you've got that. That's one option. That is a lot of work. I've done a daily show, and I think I did it for maybe 3 months before I was like, yeah, this really isn't worth it. You could have multiple shows per week, but not daily. I have seen podcasters do like a Tuesday, Thursday, a Monday, Wednesday. Sometimes they even change up their format depending on what day it is. So let's say Monday is their solo show. They're an expert in something. So it's an episode where they explore a topic that's important to them. That's what they do on Monday. And then on Wednesday, they may have a guest. You can change up your format that way because you're still saying Mondays is this, Wednesdays is this. So if someone listens to a Monday show, they know what they're gonna get. Someone listens to a Wednesday show, they know what they're gonna get, all right? So you can change things up a little bit. The most popular release is a weekly show, and I really think this offers the most bang for your buck overall. I have tried a bunch of different releases, and the weekly, it offers something for listeners because as listeners, we get into the habit of doing things on a weekly basis. Oh, on Monday I do this, on Tuesday I do this. So if listeners know that your podcast releases every Tuesday, they can incorporate that into their schedule pretty well. And so weekly seems to work out pretty well as far as a release schedule is concerned. So that would be the most popular of all the podcasts out there. Another popular option is releasing every other week or twice a month, in other words. And that can be helpful too if you don't think you're quite ready to do a weekly show. And here's a quick little tip. I'm going to talk about this more when we talk about producing your show, but you can bulk record your episodes. If you're worried about, I can't dedicate 2 whole days of my week or 1 day a week to my podcast, you can record these in advance, depending on your show format, and just release them throughout the month. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about producing and editing your show. But when you're thinking about your release schedule, don't think that you have to do multiple days to do all this. You could set aside 1 day and get all of your podcasts done for the whole month. In fact, that's what I did for a lot of my shows because I had 5 podcasts going at the same time. They were all weekly shows. There was no way that I was going to be recording every single day. So there are little tips and tricks that you can do to make the recording and getting out these episodes a little bit easier. So keep that in mind. You could release episodes on a monthly basis, but I think that's kind of tough to do if you're trying to grow a podcast audience. And here's why. As listeners, or as people in general, we don't really do things on a monthly basis, right? We don't really plan for things on a monthly basis. In fact, I really can't think of a single thing I do on a monthly basis that's really planned, maybe paying some bills and stuff like that. But as far as something I really look forward to, like some sort of entertainment, nothing's really done on a monthly basis. So while you could do that, I think it's going to be hard to grow your audience that way. Something we're starting to see more and more in podcasting are podcasters releasing their episodes according to seasons. Now, we're all familiar with seasons. We watch TV. Perhaps we wait with bated breath as our favorite TV show releases their most recent season. So in theory, that can work on podcasts. And I do like the overall idea of really focusing in on your content and then perhaps taking a break, focusing in on content when you release your second season, taking a break. I think that's a lot less daunting than saying, I'm going to launch a weekly podcast and I never know when it's going to end. It's going to go on and on and on and on. That can be a bit too much for people. So I do like the idea of seasons, but there's a couple things you have to keep in mind. First, whenever you're not releasing episodes, your listenership is going to go down. There's really no way to avoid it. You can try to run some additional ads and do some additional promotion, but really what audiences want are new episodes. They want you to release more content. So keep that in mind. If you have your first season and you take a bit of a hiatus, just keep in mind you have to do a little bit more promotion to get those numbers back up to where they were before you went on break. Number two, that could be a bit of an issue for advertisers. Most of us work with advertisers on a monthly basis. So that's the campaign. It's a monthly campaign. They're gonna base those numbers on your previous month, usually what your download numbers were the previous month. So if you're taking time off, you look a little wishy-washy, right? There's a lot of podcasters out there and advertisers wanna know they're working with the right podcast. So unless you can sell a whole season at once to an advertiser, that's amazing. Otherwise, it may be hard to get advertisers to work with your podcast if you're not releasing regular content. Now I want to talk about show segments. And you might be thinking, Sunny, I have no idea what a show segment is. And that's okay, because I'm going to explain it now. Show segments are a way to break down your episode so that your listeners, once they start listening to an episode, they listen all the way through to the end. Because we as listeners have no patience. And if we just hear one long interview between you and your guest, we're gonna get bored. We're gonna start thinking about our grocery list and what we have to do with our kids later on in the day. We're gonna think about anything but your podcast. I don't want that to happen to you. And the way to reel them back in is by changing things up a little bit. So we built in segments to the show. The people who are masters at segments are talk show hosts. So if you don't listen to a talk show, at least listen to one episode. Go on YouTube and listen to an episode. Watch an episode, because they are masters at leading into segments and then switching and going into another segment. So think about your average talk show, right? They may have a couple of guests. Each one of those guests is a separate segment. Then they may do a little tidbit with the audience, right? They've got a segment where they bring the audience members on stage and they play funny games with them or something like that. That's a segment. Maybe they let the viewers at home participate in a segment in some way, right? Contribute to the show. All of those are segments, and it rejuvenates your interest in the show. It's not just one piece of content, it's multiple little pieces of content that make up an episode. Now, I want you to start thinking about what segments might be a good fit for your podcast. And on the My Podcast plan, I do have some blanks for you. So let me give you some ideas of what's worked best in the past for my shows. I have a segment called From the Listeners, and it's basically a mailbag, but allows the listeners to submit comments and feedback on shows, and we read it on the show. In fact, I even set up a way where they could leave a voicemail. That's a great tip. If you have the opportunity, if you give your audience the opportunity to submit audio content to your show, so you actually have a soundbite you can run on your podcast, that's so much better than just reading a statement or reading their email. It really helps your audience relate better to your show, and as you're listening to it, your ears really perk up when you hear audience feedback. So you could do a From Our Listeners segment. I also had a segment called Ask the Experts. So kind of similar to From Our Listeners, where it was information submitted from our audience, but they would ask specific questions as it related to pregnancy and parenting. And then I had a team of experts that would answer the questions, and on the show, I'd pair the question with the answer, and then that was the segment. So there's an idea. If you have a more timely show, maybe you want to do a news headline segment. Let's say you have a business podcast. You could start off the show with a segment of the latest news headlines in the business world. And then you just have fun little segments you can make up. I had a segment on my pregnancy show called My Pregnancy Brain. And again, it was another way for the audience to submit content and tell me their crazy stories of having pregnancy brain and what they did. It was super fun. We all had a great laugh. And you can even reward listeners. Maybe you've got some sort of incentive you can give them. Maybe you give them a discount on something for submitting this kind of content. Make it fun. And that's how you format your show. Taking a few extra moments now to really think about what you want your episodes to look like will go a long way in getting your listeners from pushing play to reaching the end of your episode.